My name is Riley. I'm in my early 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in rooms where the loudest voices set the temperature and the quiet ones were expected to adjust. I'm a financial analyst by title, but more than that, I'm a listener. I notice patterns, I notice pauses, I notice what doesn't add up on spreadsheets and in people. If you asked my colleagues how they saw me back then, they would probably say reliable or steady, maybe even nice. Those words sound flattering, but they often mean something else. Non-threatening, easy to overlook, unlikely to push back. I wasn't underestimated because I lacked skill. I was underestimated because I didn't perform the way they expected me to. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about exposing villains or winning some dramatic showdown. It's about what happens when accuracy collides with ego and silence is mistaken for compliance. It's about discovering something you weren't supposed to see, something big, and realizing that telling the truth can quietly reposition you as the problem. At the center of this story is a mistake, a large one, a financial error that, once you see it, can't be unseen. When I found it, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt uneasy, because I knew what correcting it would imply and who it would inconvenience. The irony is that the numbers did exactly what numbers are supposed to do. They told the truth without caring who liked it. What followed wasn't explosive. There were no raised voices or slammed doors. There were meetings with polite smiles, emails that sounded supportive but felt strangely cold, an audit that praised accuracy, a human resources conversation that labeled the same behavior disruptive. Somewhere in between those two reactions, I understood something fundamental about power, how it prefers to remain invisible, and how it reacts when quietly challenged. This is a slow story. It unfolds in moments most people would miss, in looks exchanged across conference tables, in sentences that end a beat too early, in the realization that being right doesn't protect you unless you know when to speak and when not to. I'm telling it now not to settle scores, but to be honest about the cost of integrity in systems that reward comfort over correction. If you've ever felt that strange pressure to stay small so others can stay unbothered, you might recognize parts of yourself here. Before we go any further, let me ask you gently, have you ever noticed the moment when telling the truth subtly changed how people looked at you? For a long time, I believed that being dependable was enough. Not exceptional, not brilliant in a way that demanded attention, just dependable. The person who catches mistakes quietly. The one who delivered clean work on time, every time. The one whose name never came up in tense meetings because there was never a reason to say it out loud. At work, I was known as solid. That word followed me from performance reviews to casual hallway conversations. Solid like infrastructure, necessary but rarely admired. No one worried about me. No one asked if I could handle pressure. They assumed I could because I always did. And because I didn't narrate my effort, it blended into the background. I worked on financial reconciliations, internal reporting, and audit prep, the unglamorous layers of a company that only matter when something goes wrong. I sat in meetings where strategy was discussed loudly, confidently, sometimes recklessly. My role wasn't to shape those conversations. My role was to make sure the numbers didn't contradict them later. I didn't interrupt. I didn't posture. When something didn't make sense, I double-checked it on my own time before ever mentioning it. That habit came from experience. Early in my career, I learned that pointing out inconsistencies too quickly made people defensive, so I slowed down. I learned patience. I learned how to be precise without being visible. Most people read that as passivity. They thought I lacked ambition because I didn't perform it theatrically. They assumed I was grateful just to be included because I didn't challenge the room. And in subtle ways, that assumption shaped how they treated me. In meetings, my ideas were often restated by someone else a few minutes later, louder, with more confidence, and then praised. I noticed, but I didn't react. I told myself it didn't matter. The work mattered more than credit. When timelines were unrealistic, my team lead would say, "Riley will figure it out," without asking. Not because he trusted me deeply, but because he trusted that I wouldn't push back. I became the solution that didn't require negotiation. I wasn't excluded. That would have been easier to name. I was included in a way that kept me small. There's a specific feeling that comes with that kind of invisibility. It's not humiliation. It's quieter than that. It's the sense that your presence is useful but not influential. That you're valued as a function, not as a voice. I told myself this was temporary. If I kept my head down, did excellent work, and stayed professional, recognition would come naturally. Those systems rewarded consistency. That belief kept me calm. It also kept me still. What I didn't realize at the time was that people weren't neutral about my quietness. They were forming expectations around it. They were assigning me a role I hadn't consciously agreed to, the one who absorbs pressure without reflecting it back. When something went right, it was the team's success. When something needed fixing, it quietly became my responsibility. When decisions were made that strained the numbers, my job was to make them look reasonable, not to question whether they were. And because I could do that, because I was good at it, they assumed I always would. I didn't feel wronged. That's important. This isn't a story about resentment building in secret. At that stage, I still believed in the logic of fairness. I believed that clarity spoke for itself, that truth had weight, regardless of who carried it. Looking back, I can see how comfortable they were with me, how safe. I wasn't unpredictable. I didn't escalate. I didn't demand emotional labor from anyone else. I made the complicated feel manageable. But comfort, I've learned, can turn into a kind of blindness. When people get used to you smoothing edges, they stop noticing the edges altogether. They forget that someone is doing that work. They forget that the person doing it has a threshold. At the time, though, I didn't think in those terms. I just kept showing up. Logging in early, leaving late, fixing what needed fixing, saying no problem when it absolutely was one. To them, I was steady ground. They never thought to ask what would happen if that ground shifted. The first moment didn't feel important when it happened. That's how these things usually begin. Not with something dramatic, but with a comment so casual it barely registers. A small adjustment in tone. A decision made without you. About your work while you're sitting right there. We were in a weekly finance sync. 8 people on the call, cameras on, spreadsheets shared. I had flagged a minor discrepancy in a quarterly projection the night before. Nothing urgent, just something that needed clarification before it rolled forward. When my manager brought it up, he didn't say I'd found it. He said, "There was a question about this number," and then moved on. I noticed, but I let it pass. Credit wasn't the point. Accuracy was. Then one of the directors said, half joking, "We're getting a little too granular here, aren't we?" He smiled when he said it, like he was smoothing things over, like he was protecting the group from unnecessary detail. No one responded. The meeting continued. That was the cut. Not because the comment was cruel. It wasn't, but because it reframed what I'd done. The issue wasn't wrong. It was too much. Not incorrect, just inconvenient. I remember sitting there nodding along while something subtle shifted in my chest. A small tightening, a recognition. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The room had already decided how to categorize that moment. After the call, a coworker messaged me privately. "You weren't wrong," she wrote. "They just don't like getting into the weeds." That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have, because the weeds were my job. I told myself not to read into it. Everyone has preferences. Some leaders like big pictures, some don't like friction. This was normal, rational, not personal. But after that, I noticed how often similar moments occurred. A follow-up email where my language was softened by someone else before being forwarded. A comment about how I was very detail-oriented, delivered with a tone that suggested excess rather than strength. A suggestion that maybe I should save some of these points for offline, even when the meeting was explicitly about risk review. Each instance on its own was nothing. Together they formed a pattern. Still, no one else seemed to register it. Or if they did, they didn't dwell on it. I was the only one carrying the memory forward, the only one stacking these moments side by side. There's a strange loneliness in noticing something early, especially when it's not obviously harmful yet. You don't want to overreact. You don't want to assign meaning where there might be none. So you keep quiet, you keep observing. That's what I did. I adjusted my language. I added qualifiers. I framed concerns as questions rather than statements. I waited longer before speaking. When I did, I made sure to sound neutral, helpful, easy, and it worked on the surface. Meetings flowed more smoothly. No one teased me about granularity anymore. But something else happened too. The space for my observations shrank. The more I adapted, the less they expected me to contribute anything challenging. The first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't hurt enough to demand attention. But it changed how I stood, how I balanced myself. It taught me that precision could be reframed as disruption if it arrived at the wrong moment from the wrong person. And once you understand that, you start to see how silence gets rewarded. Not because it's wise, but because it's comfortable for everyone else. I didn't feel angry yet, just alert, like someone who stepped on thin ice and realized quietly that the surface isn't as solid as it looks. After a while, you stop flinching. That's the part people don't talk about, the way small dismissals, repeated often enough, begin to feel like the natural order of things. You adjust your posture around them, you build routines that avoid them. You tell yourself this is just how the environment works. I became very good at translating myself before anyone else had to. If I noticed an inconsistency, I'd first ask whether it really mattered. Then I'd ask whether it was the right time. Then I'd ask whether the person who needed to hear it would actually want to. By the time I reached the end of that internal checklist, the moment often passed. When I did speak, I softened everything. I might be missing something, but this could be totally fine. I just wanted to double check. Not urgent at all, but maybe worth a look when you have time. My words became padded, rounded, harmless. And people responded well to that version of me. They smiled more. They thanked me for being thoughtful. They joked that I was keeping everyone honest in a way that made it sound like a personality quirk, not a professional responsibility. What they didn't do was engage deeply with what I was actually saying. Concerns were acknowledged and then set aside. Questions were answered in broad strokes. Decisions were made, and my role was to reconcile them afterward. At some point, I noticed that I was being looped in later than before, not excluded, just informed after the fact. "We already aligned on this," someone would say, as if alignment were a weather event I'd somehow missed. I told myself it wasn't intentional. People were busy. Things moved fast. I was reliable, which meant they didn't worry about me. That explanation was comforting. It also kept me compliant. There's a specific mental gymnastics that happens when you normalize this kind of treatment. You start defending the system to yourself. You take responsibility for other people's behavior because it feels more controllable than acknowledging a lack of respect. Maybe I should speak up more confidently. Maybe I'm not framing things strategically enough. Maybe I need to work on executive presence. So I did. I read articles. I watched how others spoke in meetings. I practiced being more concise, more assertive, without crossing whatever invisible line seemed to exist. But the line moved. When I spoke with more certainty, I was labeled intense. When I stuck to facts, I was told to consider the broader context. When I raised risks early, I was accused of being pessimistic. None of it was said harshly. That was the trick. It was always delivered with a smile, a gentle tone, and a suggestion rather than a critique. The kind of feedback that's hard to argue with because it's framed as concern. I absorbed it all. I told myself that this was growth. That discomfort meant I was learning, that staying flexible was a strength. What I didn't realize was that I was slowly being trained out of my own instincts. I started second-guessing things I knew were off. Not because the data changed, but because I'd learned that pointing it out carried social cost, and social cost in professional settings accumulates quietly. Still, I stayed. I stayed because I believed in the work, because I liked my team, because leaving felt premature, because nothing had crossed a clear line yet, and because I thought that if I just kept delivering, eventually the respect would catch up. That's the dangerous part of being competent and patient at the same time. People assume you'll adapt indefinitely, that you won't make things uncomfortable, that you'll continue to carry weight without shifting the balance. By the time I realized how normalized the disrespect had become, it no longer looked like disrespect. It looked like an expectation. And expectations are harder to challenge than insults. I didn't feel powerless. I felt contained, like I was standing in a space that kept narrowing, inch by inch, while everyone around me insisted nothing had changed. It didn't happen in a single moment. There was no announcement, no meeting where someone said, "This is who Riley is now." It emerged slowly through repetition. I was the one you went to after decisions were made, not before. The one who made the numbers work once the direction was already chosen. The one who absorbed the friction so others could move fast. In conversations, people would say things like, "Let's run it by Riley later," which sounded respectful on the surface. But what it really meant was, Riley will adjust to this. Riley will clean it up. Riley won't challenge the premise. I became the last stop, not the first checkpoint. When new hires joined the team, they were told I was great with details and super helpful. No one mentioned judgment or discernment or the fact that I could see patterns others missed. They introduced me as support, not as signal. At first, I accepted that role because it felt useful, necessary even. There's a certain satisfaction in being the person who stabilizes things, who prevents quiet disasters, who ensures nothing collapses under the surface. But over time, I noticed how the role came with boundaries I hadn't agreed to. When I questioned assumptions, the room would subtly tense. Not openly, just enough to signal that I was stepping outside my lane. When I flagged risks early, someone would say, "Let's not overthink this," and move on. Overthinking became shorthand for disagreeing. What struck me most was how predictable it all became. The same people spoke first, the same opinions set the tone, and the same unspoken rule applied to me. Be accurate, but not influential. Be thorough, but not directional. I wasn't discouraged from speaking. I was gently redirected every time I did. There's a difference. I remember one performance review in particular. My manager praised my consistency, my reliability, and my attention to detail. Then he paused and said, "One thing to work on is being more adaptable to change." I asked what he meant. He smiled and said, "Sometimes leadership needs us to move forward, even when everything isn't perfectly defined." I understood what he was saying, but I also understood what he wasn't saying. He wasn't asking me to adapt. He was asking me to stop slowing things down by being right too early. After that, I stopped trying to expand my role. I focused on fulfilling it precisely as it was understood. I delivered what was expected, nothing more, nothing less. That's when something interesting happened. People relaxed around me. Meetings moved faster. Fewer follow-up questions were directed my way. My calendar is filled with execution work, not strategy discussions. I had been categorized, and once categorized, I was easier to manage. I didn't feel angry about it. I felt clear. Clear about how I was seen, clear about the limits of the space I'd been given, clear about what would happen if I crossed them. That clarity was sobering, but it was also grounding. It stripped away a lot of illusions I didn't know I was still carrying. I stopped expecting recognition. I stopped expecting fairness to emerge organically. I stopped assuming that good work alone would reposition me. Instead, I observed. I paid attention to what people reacted to and what they ignored, to which mistakes caused panic and which were quietly absorbed, to those who were protected and who were expendable. I didn't change my behavior outwardly, but internally something shifted. I stopped seeing my role as a reflection of my worth. I started seeing it as a function of what made others comfortable. And once you see that, you also start to see the leverage embedded in being underestimated. They thought they knew exactly what I would and wouldn't do. That assumption would matter later. The shift didn't come with confrontation. There was no argument. No moment where I decided dramatically that I'd had enough. In fact, the day itself was unremarkable on the surface, the kind of day that blends into all the others if you're not paying attention. I was reviewing a routine monthly reconciliation, one I'd done dozens of times before. Same accounts, same structure, same expectations. But something felt off. Not wrong in an obvious way, not a broken formula or a missing entry. It was subtler than that, a number that is technically balanced but shouldn't have. A variance that canceled itself out too neatly. I stared at the screen longer than usual. I told myself I was tired, that I'd been staring at spreadsheets too long. Still, I opened my notebook, the worn leather one I always kept beside me, and started mapping the flow by hand. That was when I saw it, a pattern that wasn't supposed to exist. A recurring adjustment that moved between accounts in a way that masked its own impact. It wasn't large in any single instance. It wasn't designed to trigger alerts. But over time, it added up. I felt my breath slow as I followed it backward. Month by month, quarter by quarter. Each step confirms what the last one suggested. This wasn't a one-off mistake. It was systemic. The number at the center of it wasn't something you casually flag in a meeting. It wasn't something you mention in passing. It was the kind of discovery that redefines conversations once it's named. I didn't feel excited or scared. I felt very still. That stillness surprised me. I expected adrenaline. Instead, there was clarity. The kind that settles in quietly, like a decision you didn't realize you'd already made. I closed the shared file without commenting. I didn't message anyone. I didn't raise a ticket or schedule a call. I just sat there, letting the implications surface one by one. Who owned this process? Who signed off on it? Who benefited from not looking too closely? And then, more importantly, how this would be received if it came from me. I knew the answer. Not because anyone had said it explicitly, but because of everything that had come before. The role I'd been assigned, the expectations around my silence, the way granular had become a warning label. If I surfaced this carelessly, it wouldn't be treated as a discovery, it would be treated as a disruption. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me precise. I understood in that moment that the work ahead wasn't just about the numbers. It was about timing, framing, documentation, and restraint. For the first time, my silence didn't feel imposed. It felt chosen. I spent the rest of the day doing exactly what I'd been doing for years, answering messages, attending meetings, delivering what was expected. No one noticed anything different. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer trying to be seen. I was trying to be correct, and I was willing to wait. Once you realize silence can be intentional, it changes texture. Before, my quiet had been reactive. A way to avoid friction, a way to stay within the boundaries others set for me. Now it felt deliberate, measured, almost protective. I didn't stop speaking altogether. That would have drawn attention. Instead, I became more selective. I spoke when it was expected. I answered what was asked. I offered nothing extra. The discovery stayed with me, contained. At night, I replayed the numbers in my head, not with anxiety, but with focus. I traced them again and again, looking for holes in my own reasoning, looking for an explanation that would dissolve the pattern into coincidence. It never did. So I began to document, quietly, methodically, without drama. I saved versions. I noted timestamps. I cross-referenced approvals. I didn't annotate shared files or leave comments that could be traced prematurely. Everything lived offline, in my notebook and in folders that I accessed. This wasn't secrecy, it was sequencing. At work, people interpreted my calm as compliance. Meetings continued to move quickly. Decisions were made with confidence. I nodded along when projections were presented that I knew were built on unstable ground. No one questioned my silence. In fact, they seemed relieved by it. That told me everything I needed to know. Silence, I realized, had been mistaken for agreement all along. And now, By choosing it consciously, I could let others reveal their assumptions without interference. I watched who spoke when the numbers were optimistic, who redirected when questions got close, who used phrases like, "we'll adjust later," or "this will smooth out." Each phrase was a marker. I didn't correct them, I wrote them down. The power of this phase wasn't in what I did, but in what I resisted doing. I resisted the urge to warn, to protect, to fix things before they became visible. That was harder than it sounds. There's a reflex that comes with competence, a pull toward intervention, toward preventing mistakes. Letting things proceed felt almost irresponsible. But I understood something important. Stepping in too early would collapse the structure before it revealed itself. So I waited. And the longer I waited, the more relaxed everyone became. The system operated under the assumption that the quiet, reliable person would continue absorbing inconsistencies. They had no reason to think otherwise. This wasn't about outsmarting anyone. It wasn't about trapping them. It was about allowing reality to mature to the point where it couldn't be dismissed as granular. When silence is forced, it weakens you. When silence is chosen, it sharpens you. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was positioned. Preparation doesn't announce itself. It looks like routine, like consistency, like someone doing exactly what they've always done, showing up, delivering, staying calm. That's why no one noticed when my attention sharpened. I didn't suddenly work longer hours. I didn't request new access or ask pointed questions. I stayed inside my lane so precisely that it became invisible again. But inside that lane, I mapped everything. I reconstructed workflows from the inside out. Not just what the process was supposed to be, but how it actually functioned when deadlines pressed and oversight thinned. I tracked where assumptions replaced verification, where approvals became ceremonial, where numbers were trusted because they had always worked. I learned who reviewed what and who didn't, who skimmed, who relied on summaries, who signed because someone else already had. None of this required espionage or special access. It required patience. Every system tells you where it's fragile if you watch long enough. I created parallel models on my own time. Clean versions, conservative versions, stress-tested versions. I didn't label them dramatically, just dates and neutral file names. I also documented language, not in a cynical way, but in a precise one. The phrases people used to deflect responsibility. The way risk was reframed as a delay, the subtle pressure to keep momentum. These weren't accusations, they were patterns. At the same time, I paid attention to myself, to my own impulses. I noticed when I wanted to jump in and correct something mid-meeting, when my body reacted before my mind did. Each time I paused, not out of fear, but out of discipline. There's a difference between holding back because you're silenced and holding back because you're collecting. I was collecting. I also learned how information moved upward, what executives actually saw, what got filtered out by the time it reached them, which dashboards were trusted without question. That part surprised me the most. The truth wasn't being hidden aggressively. It was being diluted, rounded, smoothed, translated into optimism. And because I was the person who usually ensured the translation held together, my absence in that role created space. Space for slippage, space for overconfidence. Still, no one noticed. Why would they? Nothing had broken yet. From the outside, I was still the same Riley, calm, efficient, quiet, the person you didn't worry about. But internally, I felt steadier than I had in years. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I wasn't trying to be understood. I was preparing for the moment when the numbers would speak louder than anyone's interpretation. That moment wasn't here yet, but it was coming, and I would be ready. The moment of confirmation didn't arrive with relief. It arrived with weight. I had reached the point where I no longer needed to ask if there was a problem. The only remaining question was how undeniable it was, so I stopped exploring and started verifying. I locked myself into the most conservative assumptions possible. I stripped out anything that could be interpreted as opinion. No projections, no extrapolations. Just historical data, approvals, and the logic the system itself claimed to follow. That's when the full shape of it emerged. The error wasn't dramatic on the surface. It didn't look like fraud or sabotage. It looked like a series of reasonable decisions made in isolation, adjustments justified as temporary, workarounds that became permanent. But when I stacked them, year over year across accounts, the total crossed a line that changed everything. 7 figures. Not theoretical exposure, not a future risk, a real accumulated misstatement that had already moved through reports, forecasts, and executive summaries. I remember leaning back in my chair and staring at the ceiling, not in shock, in recognition. This was the kind of discovery that didn't belong to a single department anymore. It implicated processes, oversight, and assumptions all the way up. And once documented properly, it couldn't be framed as nitpicking. It was too big. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sober. Because I understood something clearly now. This wasn't just leverage over a number. It was leverage over a narrative. Who noticed? Who didn't? Who dismissed early signals? Who relied on the silence of others? I prepared a private summary, not a presentation, not an email, a clean, factual document that showed the flow without commentary. No adjectives, no conclusions. Just cause and effect. I didn't attach my name to it yet. I read it 3 times, each time looking for ways it could be minimized, ways it could be reframed as context-dependent or timing-related. There were none. That was when I felt something settle in my chest. Not satisfaction, but certainty. I finally understood why I'd needed to wait, why speaking earlier would have collapsed this into a debate about tone or approach. Now the numbers stood on their own. This wasn't about me being right. It was about the system being wrong. And once a system is shown to be wrong at that scale, the question is no longer whether to act, but how. I closed the document and didn't send it. Not yet. Because discovery is only powerful if you decide how it enters the room. Once you see the full picture, pretending you haven't becomes impossible. But action isn't automatic. It's tempting to think that truth creates its own momentum, that once something is clear, the next step presents itself neatly. That wasn't my experience. I stood at a quiet crossroads, and every option carried consequences. I could escalate immediately, send the document up the chain, trigger alarms, force attention. That path was clean in theory and disastrous in practice. The discovery would be framed as sudden. My timing is questioned. My judgment was examined before the numbers ever were. I could route it through my manager, give him the benefit of context, let him decide how to surface it. But that would mean surrendering control of the narrative to someone who had already shown discomfort with too much detail. I could say nothing. Keep doing my job. Let the system continue as it was. No conflict, no risk, no disruption. That option was the easiest to imagine and the hardest to accept. Because now I knew the scale. Silence at this point would no longer be neutral. It would be participation. So I slowed everything down. I didn't rush into courage or righteousness. I sat with the weight of each outcome. I thought about what I could live with, not what would make me look principled from the outside. I asked myself a simple question. What decision still holds if no one ever thanks me for it? That question cut through everything. I realized I didn't need to be seen as brave, or smart, or difficult. I needed to be accurate in a way that couldn't be undone. The irreversible option wasn't loud. It was procedural. I prepared the findings for formal audit review, not as an accusation, but as a request for verification. I followed the company's own escalation pathways. I documented why the review was necessary without attaching motive or emotion. No commentary, no warnings, no side conversations, just facts submitted through a channel that existed specifically for this purpose. Once I did that, the decision was no longer mine alone. And that was the point. I clicked submit, closed my laptop, and went home. Nothing happened immediately. No emails, no calls, no tension in the air. But I knew something fundamental had shifted. Not because anyone reacted, but because I had crossed a line internally. I had chosen accuracy over comfort without asking permission, and there was no walking that back. After you set something irreversible in motion, there's a peculiar calm that follows. Not relief, not fear, just a widening stillness, like stepping out of a crowded room and realizing how loud it had been all along. I didn't feel powerful. I felt aligned. The decision had already been made, and now my only responsibility was not interfere with its integrity. The days that followed looked ordinary from the outside. I logged in at the same time. I responded to messages with the same tone. I attended meetings where the same people spoke confidently about projections that were now quietly under review. No one mentioned audits, no one hinted at concern. The machine kept moving, unaware that its internal logic had been challenged. That invisibility was intentional. When you move in silence, the goal isn't to disappear, it's to avoid creating ripples before the structure is ready to bear them. I didn't volunteer information, I didn't allude to anything in progress. I let the process speak in its own time. Behind the scenes, however, things were very much in motion. The audit request triggered a sequence I knew well because I'd supported it dozens of times before, from the safe side of compliance. Now, I was standing on the other side of it, watching how the system responded when scrutiny wasn't hypothetical. Requests for data began to circulate, not dramatic ones. Polite, neutral asks from internal audit, clarifications, historical pulls, approval trails. I complied with everything asked of me, promptly, precisely, without commentary. That part mattered more than anything else, because credibility isn't built when you raise concerns. It's built in how you behave once they're being examined. I didn't editorialize. I didn't connect dots for anyone unless explicitly asked. I provided raw materials and let the conclusions assemble themselves. There's a discipline to that restraint. I watched people grow slightly uneasy without knowing why. Calendars filled with quick syncs. Leaders asked for summaries they'd never requested before. The same numbers were suddenly being reviewed with new seriousness. Still, no one came to me. That was telling. It meant the review hadn't yet been framed as a problem, just as a verification, just as due diligence. The kind that doesn't threaten egos, yet. I kept my distance emotionally. I didn't speculate with coworkers. I didn't commiserate or reassure. When someone joked about audit season being annoying, I smiled politely and said nothing. Silence at this stage wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about ethics. Once a process like this begins, interference, even well-intentioned, can contaminate it. I understood that, so I stayed exactly where I was supposed to be. Cooperative, neutral, and unremarkable. What surprised me most was how easy it was. For years, I'd been holding back out of self-preservation. Now, I was holding back out of respect for the truth. The difference was subtle but profound. One felt constricting, the other felt clean. As the review deepened, I noticed shifts in how information flowed. Certain summaries stopped circulating as freely. Some dashboards were quietly revised. A few recurring adjustments were paused temporarily, though no announcement was made. People were responding without acknowledging the cause. That's what happens when a system senses a threat but hasn't yet identified its source. I also noticed who grew quieter. Not the loudest voices. The confident ones tend to stay loud until the very end. But the intermediaries, the people who usually smoothed over inconsistencies, who translated complexity into reassurance, they started asking more questions, not of me, but of the process. That told me the review was reaching sensitive layers. Through all of this, my role didn't change on paper. I wasn't promoted, reassigned, or sidelined, but subtly my workload shifted. Fewer last-minute fix-this requests, fewer assumptions that I'd absorb ambiguity without comment. It was as if the system, unconsciously, was recalibrating around the absence of my quiet corrections. I didn't step in to fill that gap. Letting things wobble slightly was uncomfortable, but necessary. Because stability built on error isn't stability at all. It's a delay. There was one moment about 2 weeks in that stands out. A senior leader asked in a meeting whether a particular variance had always been there. The question was casual, but the room went still for a fraction of a second. No one answered immediately. I felt it then. Not triumph, not anxiety, but confirmation. The conversation moved on, but something irreversible had begun. Still, I said nothing. I didn't need to speak. The process was doing the work. I also prepared quietly. just in case. I reviewed company policy, whistleblower protections, documentation standards, not because I expected retaliation, but because precision doesn't end once the numbers are submitted. It extends to how you protect the truth from being reframed later. This wasn't paranoia, it was professionalism. I made sure my personal records were complete. Dates, files, versions, not for leverage, but for clarity. Memory is unreliable under pressure. Documentation isn't. At home, my life stayed unchanged. Same routines, same quiet evenings. I didn't rehearse conversations or imagine outcomes. I resisted the urge to play the story forward. That was another kind of discipline. Because the moment you start anticipating reactions, you risk adjusting your behavior to manage them. And management of perception, of emotion, was no longer my role. My role was finished the moment I submitted the review. Everything after that belonged to the system. And systems, when confronted with their own contradictions, respond in only a few ways: denial, deflection, or correction. I didn't know which one this would choose, but I knew I wouldn't interfere. Not anymore. Consequences don't announce themselves with blame. They arrive as an absence. At first, it was subtle enough that I wondered if I was imagining it. A meeting I was usually invited to disappeared from my calendar. A report that had always gone out on Fridays was suddenly delayed. A familiar approval loop quietly rerouted through different hands. Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational. Just small gaps where certainty used to live. People often expect consequences to look like punishment or panic. In reality, they look like confusion trying to disguise itself as normalcy. The organization kept moving, but the rhythm was off, like a song played at the wrong tempo. The audit requests grew more specific, not louder, sharper. Instead of, "Can you pull this range?" the questions became, "Who approved this adjustment?" Instead of, "When did this start?" it became, "Why was this approach selected?" Those questions didn't come to me directly. They moved laterally, upward and sideways. I could feel them passing through the system, the way you feel pressure change in an elevator. People started to sense loss before they understood what was missing. The loss of certainty. The loss of assumed correctness. The loss of the comfortable belief that everything important had already been accounted for. In meetings, confidence shifted from declarative to conditional. Assuming this holds, if the numbers check out, pending confirmation. Language matters. When it changes, it's because belief has cracked. Still, no one named the cause. That silence wasn't respectful, it was strategic. No one wanted to be the first to say something might be wrong because that sentence has consequences of its own. Once spoken, it assigns proximity. It implies responsibility. So instead, people circled the idea without touching it. I watched managers become more careful with their words. Watched directors ask questions they used to wave away. Watched executives request deeper dives instead of summaries. And through all of it, they continued to treat me exactly the same. That, more than anything, told me how deeply the role assignment had set in. I was still reliable Riley, still the one who handled details, still the person who would be informed when necessary, but not consulted when uncomfortable. They didn't suspect me. They didn't blame me. They simply didn't consider me relevant to the disruption they were beginning to feel. There's a strange invisibility that happens when your actions are procedural rather than performative. Because I hadn't raised my voice, challenged anyone publicly, or positioned myself as a whistleblower, there was no emotional marker attached to me. No one connected the shift to a person. They connected it to the process. That made the consequences cleaner and harder to escape. As scrutiny increased, small defenses emerged. Not arguments, adjustments. Certain narratives softened. Forecasts were revised with cautious language. Historical decisions were reframed as context-specific or based on the information available at the time. No one was lying. They were just narrowing. When people sense exposure, they don't usually fabricate. They compress, they reduce scope, they redefine relevance. I noticed who stopped making eye contact in meetings when numbers came up, who suddenly deferred instead of asserting, who began referencing policy more than intuition. These weren't villains, They were professionals encountering the edge of their certainty. The first real consequence landed quietly. A project that had been considered green for months was paused for review. No announcement, no blame, just a delay attributed to alignment. That pause rippled outward. Dependencies stalled, timelines adjusted. Teams that had already planned around assumed outcomes were forced to wait. Frustration surfaced, but not anger, confusion. People don't get angry when they don't yet know where to point it. Someone joked in a meeting, "Feels like we're being extra careful all of a sudden." Laughter followed, light, uncommitted, but no one disagreed. That was the moment I realized the system had begun to feel the cost of its own blind spots. Not the financial cost, not yet. The psychological cost. Uncertainty slows everything. It forces reconsideration. It exposes how much momentum was built on trust rather than verification. I stayed where I was. I answered questions when asked. I pulled data when requested. I didn't volunteer interpretations or speculate about causes. A few people came close. One coworker messaged me late one afternoon, "Hey, quick question. Have these numbers always been like this?" I replied honestly and minimally, "They've followed this pattern for a while." No commentary, no emphasis. They didn't respond. Another time, someone asked in passing whether audit reviews usually took this long. "Depends on complexity," I said, which was true. There's a discipline in refusing to over-explain. Over-explanation invites interpretation. Interpretation invites distortion. I wasn't guarding myself. I was guarding the integrity of the process. Internally, though, I could feel the shift accelerating. Leadership began requesting parallel analyses, cross-checks, external confirmations. The same work that had once been deemed too granular was now quietly demanded, without irony. That didn't feel satisfying. It felt revealing. It showed how resistance to detail is rarely about efficiency. It's about timing. Detail is welcome once it confirms comfort. It's disruptive only when it threatens assumptions. And now assumptions were under review. The people who had benefited most from smooth narratives began to lose influence. Not visibly, but functionally. Their confident shortcuts no longer moved things forward. Their assurances required backup. That's when unease sharpened into something else. Not panic, but recognition. Someone, somewhere, had noticed something earlier. Someone had acted without announcing it. Someone had initiated scrutiny without attaching ego. The system didn't know who, but it knew it was too late to undo. I didn't feel powerful watching this unfold. I felt oddly detached, like someone observing a weather pattern they'd predicted, not with pride, but with acceptance. This was no longer about me being believed. The system was confronting itself, and that confrontation had a momentum no individual could stop. By the time panic appeared, it no longer looked like urgency. It looked like coordination. That's the stage people misunderstand the most. They imagine chaos, raised voices, emergency meetings, frantic emails sent at midnight. But when systems realize they're exposed, the response is rarely emotional. It's procedural, controlled, almost calm. Because panic at this level is not about fear. It's about containment. The first sign was how quickly everyone became aligned. Leaders who had disagreed openly for months suddenly spoke with one voice. Decisions that used to require debate were now unanimous, not because clarity had increased, but because divergence had become dangerous. I watched this shift with a strange sense of distance. Meetings grew shorter but more frequent. The language hardened. Words like assurance, material, and governance appeared with increasing regularity. There was an unspoken understanding that mistakes were no longer theoretical. They were documented. I noticed how carefully people spoke about the past. No one said we missed this. They said this wasn't visible at the time. No one said we assumed. They said based on the information then available. Time itself became a shield. The farther back something occurred, the more abstract the responsibility became. The closer it came to the present, the more precise everyone suddenly wanted to be. That's when attempts to fix things began. Not corrections, reframings. Adjustments were proposed that would normalize the numbers going forward, not to address what had accumulated, but to prevent further visibility. The idea was subtle. If the future looked clean enough, the past might be forgiven as transitional. It was a familiar instinct, but it was too late. Because the audit wasn't focused on projections, it was anchored in history, approvals, patterns, the exact things that can't be retroactively smoothed without creating more evidence. I could feel the tension between urgency and caution tightening. Some leaders wanted speed, to resolve, to reassure, to close the loop before questions multiplied. Others wanted distance, to slow things down, to consult external perspectives, to reduce personal exposure. That disagreement never surfaced openly. It played out in scheduling delays, in pending clarification, in documents circulated but never finalized. Meanwhile, the audit continued. What made this phase unmistakable was the way people started reaching backward, not for data, but for context. Old emails were resurfaced, past justifications revisited, conversations reconstructed from memory. Memory, however, is unreliable under pressure. People remembered being informed. They remembered nodding. They remembered someone else making the decision. What they couldn't produce was evidence. And evidence, once missing, becomes loud. I was asked, formally this time, to help pull historical support for certain decisions. The request was neutral, but the subtext was clear. Can you help us understand how this happened? I did exactly what I had done from the beginning. I pulled the data, I traced the approvals, I highlighted the sequence. I didn't explain, because explanation implies interpretation, and interpretation was no longer needed. The document spoke plainly. That's when the mood shifted from coordination to containment. Meetings went private, guest lists tightened. People who had once been central to discussions were suddenly absent. Titles began to matter more than insight. And quietly, almost imperceptibly, the question changed. It was no longer, is this an issue? It became, who is exposed by this issue? That's the point of no return. Because once responsibility enters the room, truth is no longer the only priority. Survival joins it. I saw it in the way people began to distance themselves from the process. How often they used we when discussing outcomes and the team when discussing failures. No one accused anyone. They didn't need to. The documentation had already done that work. I could sense regret now, but not the kind people imagine. It wasn't remorse for the error itself. It was regretted that it hadn't been noticed earlier. Regret that it hadn't been quietly corrected before crossing a threshold. Regret that someone, quiet, procedural, unremarkable, had noticed and followed the rules exactly. Because that removed the possibility of discretion. Once a process is engaged formally, intent becomes irrelevant. All that matters is the record. That realization hit the organization slowly, like a tide you don't notice until it reaches your ankles. By then, moving faster didn't help. Talking more didn't help. Reassuring each other didn't help. There were moments when I could feel people wanting to come to me, not for data, but for reassurance, for confirmation that this could still be smoothed over. They didn't ask, and I wouldn't have offered it anyway. Not because I lacked empathy, but because honesty at this stage meant acknowledging reality. And reality had matured past intervention. This wasn't a crisis anymore. It was a reckoning. Not emotional, not explosive, just final. The system had run out of room to reinterpret itself. And everyone, whether they said it aloud or not, understood the same quiet truth. Whatever happened next, it would not be reversible. The meeting invite arrived without drama. No subject line that hinted at urgency, no unusual guest list, just a calendar block labeled follow-up, scheduled for 45 minutes, virtual. The kind of meeting that pretends to be routine even when everyone knows it isn't. I accepted without hesitation. When the call opened, there were 4 faces on the screen. People I'd worked with for years. People who had praised my reliability. People who had gently redirected me whenever precision became inconvenient. No one smiled, but no one looked angry either. That absence of emotion told me everything. This wasn't about confrontation in the traditional sense. This was about acknowledgement. The conversation started exactly where you'd expect, with appreciation. They thanked me for my cooperation, for my thoroughness, for my professionalism during the review process. The words were careful, measured, almost rehearsed. I listened without reacting. Then one of them said it. We want to talk about how this was raised. Not what was raised, how. They framed it as concern, as process alignment, as an opportunity for reflection. HR language, softened and precise. I let them finish. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain my intentions or narrate my internal journey. I didn't recount the months of silence, the early dismissals, the careful restraint. I simply said calmly, I followed the escalation pathway outlined in policy once the materiality threshold was clear. Silence followed. Not awkward silence, considered silence. Someone asked whether I'd considered raising it earlier, informally. I did, I replied, and I chose the point at which it could be verified without interpretation. That was all. No accusation, no emotion. Another pause. They asked whether I understood how this had impacted the team. I understand it's uncomfortable, I said. Accuracy often is. That was the closest I came to commentary. The temperature in the room didn't rise. It didn't need to. What was happening wasn't emotional, it was structural. They weren't trying to shame me. They were trying to reassert control over a narrative that had escaped them. Finally, someone said the phrase that had been circling unspoken since the beginning. The audit praised the accuracy of the findings, they said, but there are concerns about disruptive behavior. The words hung there, almost gently. I nodded once. I understand, I said. Though I want to be clear, my behavior didn't change. Only the scale of what was discovered did. No one contradicted me, because they couldn't. The meeting ended without resolution, but not without clarity. I wasn't reprimanded. I wasn't praised. I was repositioned, not as invisible support, not as a problem, but as a variable they now had to account for. When the call ended, I closed my laptop and sat quietly for a moment. There was no rush of victory, no sense of justice served in a cinematic way. Just a steady understanding. The truth had entered the room without raising its voice, and it had stayed. I didn't leave the company immediately. That surprises people when I tell them this. They expect a clean break, a decisive exit that signals triumph or protest, but this story was never about escape. It was about alignment. In the weeks after that meeting, my environment changed in small, unmistakable ways. Conversations slowed when I entered the room. Not out of fear, but out of consideration. My input was requested earlier, not always welcomed, but acknowledged. When I spoke, no one joked about granularity anymore. They listened. I wasn't promoted. I wasn't sidelined. I wasn't celebrated. I was respected, and carefully. That kind of respect is different from admiration. It's quieter, more conditional. It doesn't come with warmth, but it comes with weight. And I was okay with that. What changed most, though, was internal. I no longer shaped myself to fit the comfort of the room. I didn't pre-soften my observations or translate them into something more palatable. I spoke plainly. When I didn't have enough information, I said so. When something didn't hold, I named it. Not aggressively, precisely. There's a calm that comes from no longer negotiating your own credibility. I didn't need approval to feel grounded. I didn't need recognition to feel secure. I had learned something essential. Influence doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives the moment you stop trying to manage how you're perceived. I also became more selective. Not everyone deserved my energy. Not every conversation required my participation. Silence returned, but this time as discernment, not suppression. Outside of work, I noticed changes too. I trusted my instincts more. I hesitated less when something felt off. I stopped explaining myself preemptively. I didn't become harder. I became clearer. The experience hadn't made me cynical. It had made me precise about systems. How they reward comfort, how they resist correction, how they react when accuracy disrupts narrative. And about myself, I learned that being underestimated is only a weakness if you internalize it. If you don't, it becomes cover. I still carry the same notebook. I still do the same work. But I no longer confuse invisibility with safety. I know now that truth doesn't need volume. It needs timing, it needs structure, and it needs someone willing to stand quietly beside it until it's strong enough to stand on its own. That's who I am now. Not louder, not vengeful, just unmovable. When people ask me what the lesson was, I usually pause. Not because I don't know, but because the easy answers are rarely the honest ones. This wasn't a story about courage in the dramatic sense. I didn't stand on a table or deliver a speech that changed everything. I didn't outmaneuver anyone or watch a system collapse under its own arrogance. Nothing like that happened. What happened was quieter and more instructive. I learned that systems don't resist truth because it's wrong. They resist it because it arrives too early, from the wrong person, or in a way that threatens the comfort they've built around themselves. I learned that accuracy is only disruptive when it challenges a narrative that people are emotionally invested in maintaining. And I learned something else that took longer to name. Being calm doesn't make you safe. It makes you useful. And usefulness, when unexamined, can quietly turn into expectation. For a long time, I believed that if I stayed reasonable, professional, and precise, respect would naturally follow. That belief isn't naive, but it's incomplete. Respect doesn't always emerge from consistency alone. Sometimes it emerges from boundaries, from knowing when to stop absorbing friction on behalf of others. The moment that changed everything for me wasn't the discovery of the error itself. It was the moment I stopped trying to protect people from the discomfort of the truth. Not because I wanted them to suffer, but because shielding them had come at the cost of my own clarity. And clarity, once compromised, erodes slowly but thoroughly. There's a quiet kind of dominance that doesn't look like control. It looks like a restraint, like documentation, like timing. It looks like choosing the process over the performance, choosing structure over validation, choosing to let reality speak instead of narrating it yourself. That's not passivity. That's discipline. I don't tell this story to encourage suspicion or to romanticize conflict. I tell it because many people, especially those who work carefully, accurately, and without spectacle, are taught that their only options are silence or escalation. There's a third option: positioning. Positioning yourself so that when the truth arrives, it doesn't need you to defend it, so that it can't be reframed as attitude, tone, or intention, so that it stands on its own weight. If there's a moral here, it's not always speak up or always stay quiet. It's this: know the difference between silence that erases you and silence that prepares you. One diminishes you, the other preserves you. And once you've felt that difference, you don't go back. Before we end, I want to ask you something, not as a lesson, but as an invitation to reflect. Have you ever been labeled difficult, too detailed, or disruptive simply for being accurate? And how did you respond when you realized it? If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your perspective in the comments.